I'm the author of a couple of books, published by Penguin, on the topic of escaping poverty and becoming wealthy. Above all, my interest is in helping families to escape generational cycles of poverty. Today I'd like to share with you what is, in my opinion, the very worst book written on this topic over the past century. I'd like to show you what's wrong with it, why you should avoid it, and how to debunk its ideas. Meet Thomas Piketty, author of what might just be the deadliest, most radical book on economic ideas since Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, and frankly, one that is not all that different. In 2013, Piketty published his voluminous work, Capital in the 21st Century. The book is massive and reaches a broad range of conclusions. I've read it and I'll spare you the boredom. Beneath barren stretches of verbiage and endless charts, boring to the point of being coma-inducing, its most significant conclusions were: 1. Wealth is concentrating among the super-rich who are hoarding and amassing the resources of the world. 2. Their assets help them to produce more assets, which leads to a spiral holding them perpetually atop society. 3. This represents tyranny and oppression and must be stopped for the good of society. 4. The goal is not to solve poverty. The goal is to solve inequality. And 5. To solve all of this, a global tax and redistribution policy must be put in place. Taxes on businesses and wealthy individuals should be cripplingly punitive. Assets should be seized. Even your children should not be allowed to inherit from you. The flaws in Piketty's work are numerous. They are moral, philosophical, and procedural. The moral one is obvious. You are not allowed to steal from people. Like all Marxists, Piketty pretends this away with a terminology switch. It's not stealing, it's redistribution. If the government does it, it's somehow morally acceptable. If you prioritize individuals and their sanctity and their rights, this argument holds no water. If you are a collectivist, though, well, then everything changes. Because us is more important than your sovereignty or your rights. This simple switch in thinking has been the basis for the greatest tyranny our species has ever seen, oppressing and murdering more people over the course of the past 100 years alone than any other ideology in history. The idea us equals more important than individual rights is the human race's single most deadly idea. Let us dismantle some of Piketty's assumptions, which derive directly from Marxist theory. Our first observation is perhaps the most interesting. His primary claim might not even be true. Lord Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, was quoted in a Financial Times article saying, "The principal weakness of the book is that the carefully assembled data do not live up to Piketty's rhetoric about the nature of capitalism." The Financial Times' own investigation revealed many unexplained data entries and errors in the figures underlying some of the book's key charts. These are sufficiently serious to undermine Professor Piketty's claim that the share of wealth owned by the richest in society has been rising. After referring back to the original data sources, the investigation found numerous mistakes in Piketty's work. Simple fat finger errors of transcription, suboptimal averaging techniques, multiple unexplained adjustments to the numbers, data entries with no sourcing, unexplained use of different time periods, and inconsistent uses of source data. Together, the flawed data produce long historical trends on wealth inequality that appear more comprehensive than the source data allows. Next, even if his data were proven to be correct, Piketty then assumes that wealth is a common public resource. Wealth merely exists and should therefore self-evidently be equally distributed. Piketty has little to nothing to say about how wealth is originally generated. This is the fatal flaw in all Marxist thinking. It is the fallacy of a man who imagines economics as equivalent to approaching a picnic table, situated in isolation and declaring, "Here is some wealth. Now how shall we share it fairly?" Such a man has missed, or worse, intentionally ignored, a number of important questions, which have legal and moral consequences. Who made the picnic? Why is it ours to take? Doesn't their ownership matter? What were they planning on doing with it? Why is it okay for us to take it from them? Shouldn't we be focusing on learning how to create our own picnic rather than fixating on confiscating theirs? And so forth. Piketty reasons as though the mere tableau of wealthy people, viewed from the outside and perceived as very bad, is sufficient to justify their disintegration. But wealthy people are not a public relations exercise for us to judge as good or bad. These are individuals and families who have each generated their fortunes in a varied multiplicity of ways, over which it is not our place to morally preside. Would these rich people, by the same token, be permitted to judge how poor people acquire and spend their money? If not, why the double standard? Why are we permitted to judge their personal financial affairs? Because it presents a bad tableau? As economist Thomas points out, quote, "No third parties can possibly know the values, preferences, priorities, potentialities, circumstances, and constraints of millions of individuals better than those individuals know themselves." Sal proposes that people who attempt such redistributionist arguments tend to confuse morals with productivity, as though wealth were about values of equality and not about carrying out the business activities that generate wealth. Quote, "An economy is not a moral seminar authorized to hand out badges of merit to deserving people. An economy is a mechanism for generating the material wealth on which the standard of living of millions of people depends." Next, Piketty conflates wealth with power, and in doing so, he dismisses even the possibilities of democracy and rule of law. His assumption is that those with money will always and necessarily win at the games of law and democracy. In this assumption, there is a definite grain of truth. This can and does happen. However, Piketty points to it as the always applicable, never refutable rule of life. He also errs in using this basis to argue that capitalism must therefore be reformed, not law or democracy. Objectors would use the exact same basis to argue a very different point. If there are instances when money can buy law or power, then it is the law and the democracy that need reform toward honesty. It is not the case that the moneyed should be destroyed. Piketty is thus focusing on the wrong side of the argument. Next, and this is fairly mind-blowing, Piketty pretends away the greatest economic miracle in human history. Piketty flat out ignores, and in some key ways, falsifies and disguises the fact that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty in a shorter span of time than any other force in history. Perversely, he not only fails to acknowledge and applaud this miracle, but he actually turns capitalism into the enemy of the poor. This is a gross perversion of truth and a terrific disservice to the poor. Another inconvenience that Piketty pretends away: the poor are getting richer too. Piketty ignores, and in some key ways disguises the fact that although the super-rich are indeed getting richer at an exponentially increasing rate, the poor are getting richer too, just not as quickly. He fixates on the difference between the two and not the improvement. To do this, he must revisit the old communist propaganda technique. It used to be about meeting need. But when capitalism did that beautifully, communists had to reframe the argument as being about equality and not against poverty. This again is the classic error, or worse, deception, of the Marxist economist. Difference is not a bad thing. Poverty is a bad thing. And even increasing difference is not a bad thing. It would only be a bad thing if the numbers of people in poverty were trending downward. They are not. They are trending upward. Thus, increasing difference points to incredible new breakthroughs in market growth and business innovation. These are good things. Next, Piketty proposes eating the capital. He is essentially proposing that the world eat the excess capital, rather than using it for further growth. Piketty proposes that the wealth, seen as a blob, be redistributed to meet the needs of the poor. This represents a consumptive view. By contrast, entrepreneurs and economists know that the best thing to do with excess capital is to utilize it for innovation and for new growth, to make new things possible. This is called a generative view. This is what the 1% tend to do. Their growth, therefore, actually represents a heightened capacity to contribute to humanity, not a hoarding of resources. Finally, Piketty falls into that obvious trap of believing that one going up must mean that the other one is going down. Piketty commits another common Marxist error in his simplistic assumption that the gain of one implies the loss or the theft from another. This is simply not how free markets work. The wealthy do not take wealth from the rest of the world. They generate value anew. The former idea implies that there once existed a set amount of wealth, and the rich have simply been gathering it to themselves ever since then. Eventually, they will have all of it, and none will be left. This is nonsense. It doesn't work that way. Take the simple example of the richest company in the world in 2019-2020, Apple. They became the richest company on earth by providing useful products and services, all of which we freely buy from them of our own will, and all of which contribute to making us more productive and hence wealthier. Apple did not find a pile of wealth and confiscate it. Instead, they generated value. Then, as a result of using their products, the people who purchased them generated value in different ways, via their own work as enabled by Apple products. Not only do we also gain value when we buy from them, but we use what we have bought to create more new value still. Piketty simply refuses to see this. He also presumes that the rich hoarding all the resources means that there is no potential capital available to anyone else. Writing for Forbes magazine in an article titled 6 Ways Thomas Piketty's Capital Isn't Holding Up to Scrutiny, Kyle Smith argues that this is simply not true. Quote, "A huge pool of potential capital is widely available to the non-rich. Moreover, many of the rich also use this capital to fund new startups and new venture businesses. In this way, the capital available to the rich becomes the capital available to the poor. The richer the rich get, the more capital they make available to the poor." There are many additional flaws in Piketty's book, and it's easy to pick them apart. But more useful than that is to understand what we believe and what we propose to turn the tables and go on the offensive. Begin with the clear assertion that free market capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system in history. That is the utilitarian argument for capitalism, but it is also the kindness argument. You proceed from that to the moral argument. It goes like this. Socialism is structurally immoral, insofar as it constitutes compulsory confiscation from those who generate wealth. Free market capitalism, by contrast, is highly moral. Nothing promotes peace like free market capitalism. Firstly, it is a strong deterrent to wars between nations. Secondly, it is a strong incentive for disparate groups of people to overcome their differences in the interests of mutual cooperation and mutual benefit. Thirdly, its operating conditions are premised on trust and fidelity. It compels us to learn to trust one another and, in turn, to live up to the trust expected of us. When we break faith or betray trust, we lose our capacity to do future business. This weeds out the bad faith players in a process similar to evolution. It gradually improves societies. Thus, it is a virtuous cycle. It actively makes us better, and it actively promotes good behavior. Finally, the free market system spurs innovation. It is responsible for every life-saving invention you care to name. Every good product that helps people, keeps children safe, increases our medical care and our standards of living, or saves lives, our families' lives, started with either a capitalist incentive or was made possible by free market demand. Piketty's ideas have now been debunked so often and so thoroughly that there exists an entire subcategory of books called The Problem with Piketty. Yet here's something curious. Listen to the language heard on the news. Watch for those phrases like the 1%ers and taking from the rest of us, all of that kind of Marxist garbage, and ask yourself why, if it has been debunked, it is still in common usage. Next, try this experiment. Walk into a bookstore and see if you can find the original Thomas Piketty book, Capital in the 21st Century. I guarantee you in almost any bookstore in the world, you'll find it there. Now see whether or not the books pointing out the factual inaccuracies, the errors, the omissions, and the outright lies are anywhere to be found beside that book. I find that in most cases you simply do not see them. You have to order them online. Weird. To that end, I think one of the best books on the topic is called Equal is Unfair. It points out how there is an axis between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, and you can have one or the other, but not both. When you start looking for socialist equality of outcome, you must necessarily transgress human rights. That's the problem with socialism. If you're looking for good books on wealth, here is my advice if you care to take it. Look for the word value. If a book on wealth hinges around the word value, how it is created, how it is generated, how you share it, how you grow it, then you're probably on the right track. If by contrast the book hinges around the word redistribution, run for your life. It's the most dangerous idea we've ever had. For my money and for yours, that's the worst book on wealth in the past 100 years.